still recall the day I set out on my own. Not much at all, but dreams to make it all home. Then came the time, stand up for all that I knew. Thieves in the night, taking the pain that I lived through. You at my side, finding the strength to move ahead, crossing the line with help and love from friends, holding the light that many thought was dead. I've ridden the wind with the sun in my face. I rode in the wind in the cold and rain. No, I wouldn't change my life by one day. I'll ride in the wind till I'm home once again.
The television screen has become the retina of the mind's eye. The battle for the mind of North America will be fought in the video arena, the Videodrome. The television screen is the retina of the mind's eye. Therefore, the television screen is part of the physical structure of the brain. Therefore, whatever appears on the television screen emerges as raw experience for those who watch it. Therefore, television is reality, and reality is less than television.
We skip the light fandango, turns cartwheels across the floor. I was feeling kind of seasick. The crowd called out for more. The room was humming harder as the ceiling flew away. When we call out for another drink, the waiter brought a tray. And so it was that later, as the miller told his tale, that her face at first just ghostly turned the wider shade of pale. He said there is no reason, and the truth is plain to see. But I wander through my playing cards, would not let her be one of 16 Vestal virgins.
Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the agenda. My name is Jenn Smith, and yes, for those who may be curious, I am transgender. Tonight we're going to be resuming what has turned into a trio of interviews with Jon K. Uhler, who is who formerly worked with sexual predators and pedophiles with the Pennsylvania State Corrections Bureau, I guess you call it there. And he spent 11 years there and gleaned an awful lot of information about sexual predators and pedophiles and psychopaths. And tonight we're going to get into exactly how this might be related to what's going on with the transitioning of kids today. And that will be coming up here in a moment when I bring in Jon. I hope you like my choice of opening songs. This one's going to be a little obscure. I'm not going to tell you why I put it there. Let's just say that it has meaning, and I'll let you try to figure that out. Now, before I bring in Jon, I just want to take a moment to talk a bit about something that's important to me and something that I think that everybody should come to understand. And let me just bring up a quote for you here from one of my favorite authors. This is Philip K. Dick, best known as a science fiction writer, but he was, he called his writing fictionalized philosophy, because there was a deep philosophy sort of driving his writing. And one of the things that he talked about, let me just bring this up here, was about the importance of language. So he noted that the basic tool for the manipulation of reality is the manipulation of words. If you control the meaning of words, you can control the people who must use the words. Okay, so that is something that we're seeing a lot, and those who have followed me over time know that I'm very interested in language. I've been in this political debate now for about 3 years. I'm beginning to sense that perhaps, I mean, everybody has a shelf life, so how much more time I'm going to have to get my ideas out to the world, I don't know. But what I want to start doing is getting everything that I've learned over the course of the years out to the public, particularly the most important things. And one of the most important things that I think people can understand today, in order to not just to understand this whole transgender debate, but to understand the politics of power in general, and that is the manipulation of language. When you listen to politicians, or when you listen to scientists and people who have political agendas or financial agendas, particularly people who have to deal with the public on an ongoing basis, you have to pay very close attention to their word choices. Because whether we're talking politicians or scientists, they don't like to lie. They do like to manipulate you and steer you in certain directions, or steer you towards certain conclusions. But they don't like to lie, because that will come back to bite them in the butt later. So what they try to do is to subtly maneuver you in certain directions and maneuver you towards making conclusions without actually saying it. And then once you make the conclusion, if later on you realize that was a false conclusion, you can go to the politician and say, hey, you led me to believe such and such. The politician will say, well, no, I didn't say that. I said, you know, whatever it was. So they're always manipulating words. So I've talked about this with Jordan Peterson and some of the other sort of high profile, politically charged people, are like high profile people out there, and the fact that he's always playing these word games. So always clarify things with politicians, right? So this comes into the transgender debate, and I talked about this last week on last week's show about Ken Zucker, right? And the fact that Ken Zucker sort of goes around masquerading as somebody who's opposed to child transition, right? But he doesn't explain in his conversations that he defines child differently than most of the people who are in the audiences listening to him. Most of the parents, for instance, who have teenagers who are identifying as transgender, are unaware that though Zucker says that he's opposed to child transitioning, that he's not talking about their kids, but because they understand the child to be a minor, they think that he is. But in reality, he only poses transitioning for use under the age of 12. Okay, so that's the clinical definition of child. And that's what I talk about with politicians and stuff too, is that they're always very careful about what words they are choosing. James Cantor, who we talked about previously as well, he doesn't at any time ever say that he has proven that pedophiles are born that way. He says the evidence suggests, and things like this, things that don't really actually, make the claim that it's been proven, but leads you to sort of think that it has. So whenever you're listening to politicians or scientists who have political or are involved in a political question, or there's money involved, always make sure that what they're saying is very clear. And if there's any wiggle room, right, or if words can be interpreted in any number of ways, you need to get that clear. And there's nothing that I think is more important. And people, again, who have followed me will know that my educational background was in history and political science. But when I was in university, I focused my attention as much as I could and focused my studies as much as I could on the history, the evolution, and the application of propaganda and mass manipulation strategies used by governments and other elite parties. And so this is one of the things I bring to the table here, and I'm going to be sharing more and more of how that works in the future. So let's see here. Yeah, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring Jon in again, and we'll get straight to the topic. We'll do a little recap on some of the things that I think that people should have in the forefront of their mind as we get into this discussion. And then we'll get into this question that I've avoided for a long time. So let me just bring in Jon. Hello, Jon. Welcome back to the show.
Jenn, I appreciate you having me for a third time here.
Yeah, it was
we'll see how long
one show, right?
Can hang in there with us.
Well, I think it's. I think people are finding it very enlightening, and it's, as I said before, it's sort of an interesting merger of two different types of expertise on a subject that's really gripped society at large over the last, especially 5 years. So it's interesting, and tonight we're really going to see. Well, this is really going to be where your expertise and my expertise sort of come together, and we can sort of go over some of your theories and my experiences and research in this regard. So, I should say to people that Jon has had some troubles with, I guess it's a benign kind of skin cancer, and that sort of flares up.
Circles, and I was going to come up with a good story, but that's all there is. So.
Yeah, like
little cream that's highlighting some things, which is a perfect word picture or analogy, Jenn, for what we're going to be talking about, because you can have stuff going on under the surface undetected until you shine a little light or put some cream. We're going to put some cream of truth on this, and we'll find out. So that's really a little trivia. There's public safety announcement. If you have anything on your face you're not quite sure of, go to a dermatologist.
Right. Well, actually, I have terrible skin too, but I get to cheat because I get to use makeup, right? So
there you go. There you go.
You'll have to get your wife working with you there. Maybe.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so let's see here. Where shall we start?
Well, if I can be so bold, Jenn, let me jump in and really emphasize what you just said, that because for me, the bottom line behind all of this that we're going to be talking about now in the trans movement is, from my perspective, you have kids that are being targeted, kids that are being solicited, kids that are being manipulated, ultimately by use of language themselves. I mean, the perpetrators. But the parents and the public are being told certain things. And the people that are telling them are masters of manipulation and deception using language. That's how psychopaths work. That's how cults work, because every cult leader is a psychopath. And so it's very, very important for people to understand it will always come down to language. He who captures the narrative will win the argument, so to speak, will change minds. And so perpetrators know the power of the big lie, that you put something out there that can be so big and so outrageous, but if you appear to be sincere, if you appear to be serious about it, people will begin to back off, because the predators and the perpetrators and the psychopaths, all one and the same, understand that if they can get people to dispense with their intuition, then they have them. And there's no ability to think critically or analytically. And it all comes down to the language.
Yeah, and I think that's something important that you brought up previously. So just sort of recapping what we've gone over in this series, one of the things that I thought was important that we've covered that people should keep in mind is the role that pornography has played in society in general. And I'm going to, during the course of our discussion here, talk about the role I think pornography has played in the whole sort of transgender phenomenon. So we'll get into that. Now, there's a lot of people out there, such as Deborah So, part of the Toronto cabal, who've been saying that pornography is not really the big problem that people are making out to be, and that you can't become addicted to pornography and this type of thing, which is a claim that I essentially reject out of hand.
Well, that's one of those big lies. She just puts it out there. She has no clue what she's talking about. I always, none of it's funny, but I'm sort of warped, having worked in a prison for a while. I always think to myself, Deborah So and other women that are pushing this kind of stuff, pushing kink. You know, you can say it's nouveau or cutting edge, pardon the pun, or you can sell this stuff. But woe to you when you finally meet a guy that I understand that has consumed that which you are pushing, and now you're stuck in a room with him. And then go ahead and talk about how this doesn't impact a guy. Right. That's why it's so sick. There's no other way to put it. I can understand guys. I have no tolerance for it, but I can understand a guy trying to tell me why porn is harmless, because he's trying to justify and rationalize and normalize and all that. But for a woman, I mean, the author of the 50 Shades of Grey is a female. You look at Keith Raniere in Nixon. You look at Epstein and Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell. These perpetrators inevitably will have women. And so when you helping them, so for me, when you have a woman that pushes dark stuff, porn and pornified stuff and kink, you either have a brain dead individual that's just trying to achieve notoriety and sound kind of cool, or really, really dark. But either way, I laugh to myself thinking, lady, you better hope you never run into the end result of what you're pushing, because I used to work with them behind bars, and you wouldn't know what to do. They'll have you for lunch, so to speak. Right, and we'll get into that in a moment here, because I want to play a brief clip that we played previously, an edited version of that on Camille Paglia, who's one of these women that you're talking about, who's pushing this stuff. But on the role of pornography and specifically violent pornography and its impact on psychopaths and sort of encouraging them down these dark, deviant paths that you talked about. Again, we sort of looked at this last week, but the fact that people such as the prolific serial killer John Wayne Gacy was buried in porn. A photo you can't really see here, but it's his huge collection of pornography. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, kept what he called a mother lode collection of pornography. The serial killer and necrophile Edmund Kempter used pornography in detective magazines for erotic stimulation. But the list could go on and on and on and on. So this is a real thing. And of course, previously we played the clip from Ted Bundy, who talked about the role pornography and critically the mixing of violence and pornography played
in his evolution and movement towards, becoming one of the most prolific and notorious serial killers ever. So anybody who tries to downplay that, I think, is dangerously deceptive.
Yeah. Jen, can I speak to that just real fast for a second? Because you'll have some people, the majority of those that will defend porn use will be guys, understandably. My response to the full range of pushback is simply this. Because, of course, what we hear is, well, wait a second, John, just because some guy gets into porn doesn't mean, correct. I've never said that if a guy looks at porn, he's going to become a serial killer. What I've said is this: 100% of sex offenders, 100% without exception, were more progressively and heavily involved in pornography prior to offense. 100%. 100% of pedophiles are always busted with child porn, and usually possession and distribution. So 100%. So we know it has an impact. And to become a pedophile, you have transitioned through very predictable stages of porn use, starting with adult porn. It's always the case. If a guy wants to debate that, he either doesn't know or he's deceptive. Now, what about for the guys that, okay, I'm not going to get into that. Well, you can't hide behind the fact that the porn most people, older folks, maybe that's us, are thinking about are the 70s and 80s, maybe 90s porn. I just completed a podcast on the dangers of college sex week. Does it attract sexual predators? And again, I simply just do Google searches for the clips that I put in my different videos. The stuff that's available on a simple Google search takes my breath away, and I probably couldn't use 75%. So the porn of yesterday is now is more mild than 50 Shades of Gray. So what I would say to those on the most quote unquote mild end of the argument is this: in the year 2020, I can't even imagine what's out there, because I just found films on Google on kink, okay, where you tie women up in the most outlandish and outrageous things, and those are stage performances now. And then choking, oh, there we go, and then here we go, knife play.
That's a new one.
It's like going back into prison for me as I'm reading this stuff. I'm looking at these different descriptions, and I think to myself, women haven't got clue one what they're dealing with, number one. But for any guy to try to defend porn, the reality is this: I can guarantee you the guy's not the same, whether or not he cares that he's not the same any longer. But you cannot put crap into your mind and come out the same, garbage in, garbage out. That's exactly what I tell the sex offenders. Mm-hmm. And they will be the ones to defend porn at first until they find out that what I am. I'm all over this issue. So I simply say this: for any woman dating a guy, for this issue of porn, if anybody defends it, it was already bad enough in the 70s and 80s. You defend porn in the year 2020, or you minimize its impact, there's a reason why you're denying it and you're minimizing it, and you're already dark. That's all I got to say. You're already a danger to somebody in one way or another, and guaranteed any woman that connects with a guy that's into porn, the relationship's over before it began. He's going to use her to get what he can get, and he's done. Right. I'll tell you if I feel strongly about this subject.
Right. So, like I said, sort of last week, the thing of real concern to me is that violent porn that we're talking about, and even it doesn't even have to be like XXX rated, right? I put a screenshot up previously about the TV series True Blood, which are these vampires, and they depict violent sex with these vampires and blood everywhere, and it's horrific. It doesn't have to be like graphically explicit in terms of the sexual process and stuff. Just that sort of mixing of the act of sex and violence can be very dangerous. And people say, well, I've been watching stuff like that for a long time, and I haven't turned into a criminal and that type of thing. As James Dobson pointed out in a video clip I played last week, what you don't seem to understand, or maybe you don't care about, is not so much the effect it's having on you. It is permanently, like you say, it is permanently altering the person. It's like putting mud in clear water, right? It's not going to come out, right? You can try your best, but it's still there. But beyond that, it's the effect that it has on these psychopaths that we've been talking about, right? So you put all kinds of violent imagery out there on the web for somebody who has psychopathic inclinations, and that is something that's going to fuel them. And we see it over and over again with these serial killers and stuff. Now, child pornography is out there on the web too, and they seem to have, for whatever reason, they can't get rid of it. But this is one of the things where I talk about systemic biases and the fact that the establishment itself does not want to get rid of this stuff. So when I say a man can't be a woman, right, and when I refer to somebody such as myself as a male, Facebook and Twitter and Google and YouTube and all these people can censor me out of existence, basically. And I remember when I was banned permanently from Twitter for saying that I would never refer to Morgane Auger as a woman. That apparently was a permanent banning offense. So they banned me. But not only did they ban me, but they have like mechanisms to track. So they track the machine addresses of my computer, my laptop, my cell phone, all kinds of other things. And I could not create new accounts on Twitter without going through, like I had to go through all kinds of sort of secondary channels to get a second account created, and eventually they destroyed that as well. But another thing to keep in mind, and I think this is a perfect illustration that sort of proves to me the fact that the establishment doesn't want to get rid of child pornography, and they don't want to get rid of violent porn, because when I upload videos to Google, in my strains, people know I use music. It's copyrighted music. I sometimes use brief clips from movies and stuff. Google has this incredible search engine. So I can go in, and one of the best examples is I went in and I took a very short scene of the movie Terminator, and I put it into one of my shows, but I changed the speed with which the clip plays, and I altered the music. But Google had a computer that was so powerful, they could go through my 2-hour stream, pick out this scene, take it apart, compare it with a database of millions of movies and songs and stuff, and come back with a hit that says, yeah, you're using a scene out of the movie Terminator, right? And they immediately marked my video as cannot be monetized. Right? I can still use it, I just can't monetize it. But the same thing with songs. Okay, how many songs have been published? Millions of songs have been published. I can put in a 20-second clip from a song in one of my videos. Google will take it, compare it to their massive database of songs, and immediately bring back, okay, this is a copyright violation. That is awesome computing power, right? They have enormous power. If they wanted to block child porn, it would be so easy for them. If they wanted to block this violent porn and this knife play stuff that's out there, it would be so easy for them, but there is no will to do that. That's my feeling. Like, I think the establishment supports all of this stuff.
Jen, excellent point. As a matter of fact, I'm in the midst of doing a multiple part series against the legalization of prostitution. Interviewed Jackie Gwynn. She worked over in Australia. She worked in a legal brothel, and that was eye-opening for me, and I'm still in the midst of doing that. But the very first part one, I've never monetized my videos, but they have not allowed me to put it on there. I have a clip of Pretty Woman that probably lasts 15 seconds, maybe 30 seconds, and it rejects it. So I haven't been able to publish part one. It's on survivorsport.net, but part two they were okay with. But maybe it was the title when I said who's pushing prostitution to become, quote unquote, a legalized occupation.
Right. And I, as somebody who was in the prostitution business, if you will, for quite some time, and knew many others who are in the business. I've never supported the legalization of prostitution. It's something that's that I don't think you'll ever get rid of from society. It's they call it the oldest profession for a reason. I don't think you'll get rid of it, but I think it's very dangerous to legalize it, and because I think what would happen is that it would turn into the corporate world exploiting it, right? So you would end up with whorehouses and stuff like that, right? Where the money that these women who are degrading themselves, and some men too, who are degrading themselves and subjecting themselves to some very unpleasant things much of the time, the money that they would get would be greatly decreased, so there would be less return. So just from a sheer sort of in the interests of the women argument, I'm opposed to the legalization of prostitution. And also sort of the message that it sends out to society as well. Although
and trafficking, what has happened in Australia and New Zealand and Europe, the illegal trafficking just goes up exponentially, like 4 times what the legal does. So it's kind of interesting topic.
Right. Well, yeah, as soon as you make it legal, you're going to end up, I think, at least this is my theory, you'd end up with sort of a glut in the market, in terms of you'd have tons of women who might otherwise not have done it because it's illegal entering it, and that's going to put a downwards pressure on the income stream. Although I know some people probably get mad that I'm talking about income.
It's true. It's true. It's important to look at. So I wasn't aware of that whole world until I started doing it.
Now, one thing that you mentioned last week that I don't know if you want to get into, you had said that you were looking at the DSM task force and some of the people who are part of the DSM task force. I think, did you say for gender dysphoria? Was it pedophilia, or that whole section?
Well, they brought to the forefront gender dysphoria. It was never a major issue, and that's a perfect segue into it. But yeah, there's 12 people plus a primary chair for that. And when you look at their backgrounds, it's, and I've only looked at 7 of their backgrounds. At some point in time, I'll do a whole series on it. But it's very clear that the majority of those, and I'm only up to the 7th person. You had one guy who, a doctor whose background was looking at male sex offenders, and his perspective is different than mine. I don't think he spent time working in a prison. You had an OBGYN, but then the other 5 so far, so I've only gotten through half, in one way or another, they have an agenda. And that's why gender dysphoria suddenly appeared in the DSM and was therefore billable for the very first time in 2013. As a matter of fact, survivorsupport.us, that's my blog. And what about, why are professionals missing the red flags about trans kid? I have some charts. I don't know if you have them. We're going to show them. But if you look at the point at which the DSM-4 and DSM-5 brought to the forefront for the very first time, DSM-4 in the year 2000, suddenly we had the term gender identity.
Right.
Never existed prior to that. And then in 2013, gender dysphoria. And you look at the charts as far as referrals to gender clinics.
Yeah, we'll get into that too. I'll bring
there
up
you
all
go.
of your charts, and you can sort of walk us through what you see there. What I want to do right now, though, in sort of, because I say I want to sort of get some things fresh in people's minds that they should be aware of as we get into this discussion here. So I want to play right now just a brief clip from Camille Paglia, I don't know how you pronounce that exactly, but and who she is and what she represents. And this whole question of this curious Toronto cabal who are like I say, it's a very strange thing. And I became aware of them immediately because I saw them as they sort of entered this debate one by one. And one after another, they entered saying that they essentially were on my side and opposed to child transitioning. But almost every single one of them also promoted this born that way pedophile narrative, right? And I was like, okay, what's going on? Who are these people? But let's just take a look at the psychology quickly, the psychology of these people, starting with Camille Paglia.
Camille Paglia, a self-described dissident feminist, is being presented to us as a voice of reason in the current political climate. She is lauded by conservative news outlets as an unlikely ally in the fight against progressive tyranny, championed by individuals such as Jordan Peterson, and promoted by the intellectual dark web. There is, however, something that all of them fail to mention about Camille Paglia. She is pro-pedophilia and has for decades advocated for the legalization of both pedophilia and child pornography. Her 1991 book, Sexual Personae, is even quoted on the official North American Man-Boy Love Association website, where she asserts that pedophilia is both rational and honorable, encompassing what she says is a beauty that Christian morality fails to recognize. Paglia has repeatedly gone on record stating that she thinks child pornography and pedophilia should both be legalized. Paglia spoke about strategies for removing the stigma from, quote, man-boy contacts, lamented that some people treated her like a monster when they discovered she is pro-pedophilia, and stated that she believes there is nothing wrong with adults engaging in, quote, sex play with children as young as 8 years old. In that same interview, Paglia indicates that the only thing she respected postmodernist intellectual Michel Foucault for was for his position on pedophilia.
Foucault, another way to ask this is who argued, no, I guess the answer would be, argued for the eradication of age of consent laws as in down to infants.
Who is Foucault?
In the year 2000, Paglia offered us a deeper insight into the origins of her pro-pedophilia thinking. She wrote a column for Salon entitled The Purity of Allen Ginsberg's Boy Love. Paglia wrote that Allen Ginsberg had enormous influence on her intellectual development, and that she would be proud to call him her guru, stating that Ginsberg had, quote, visionary sexuality, and that his, quote, celebration of boy love was pure and sinless. Allen Ginsberg was a beat poet, notorious pedophile, and one of NAMBLA's earliest supporters.
Sweet boy, give me your ass. Let me kiss your face, lick your neck, touch your lips.
Why is Camille Paglia being promoted by the media, the intellectual dark web, and people such as Jordan Peterson? Peterson even had her on his podcast and promoted her book in which she defends pedophilia.
Okay. All right.
That's a good one to close on.
We agreed on everything. I knew it. I knew it. All right, great.
Thank you very much.
Something isn't right here. Paglia is being sold to us as a defender of social stability and champion of Western values, when in reality she is working to pierce the heart of the moral foundations of our civilization. She wants to legalize adults having sex with children and the production and distribution of child pornography. Why is she being promoted?
Why indeed? Okay, but this one of the reasons I present Camille Paglia is because she is indicative of an elite mindset that is out there. There are people out there who believe that the prohibitions on sex between adults and children is sort of a prudish relic of yesterday or something like that. So that mindset is out there in what we'll call the liberal community. Okay, and let me just, again, just doing a refresher, I want to remind everybody of James Cantor, and I'll play a brief clip that will go over his views that you should keep in mind.
My name is James Cantor. I'm the director at the Toronto Sexuality Centre in downtown Toronto, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Toronto Faculty of Medicine. Now that people have gotten accustomed to the idea that somebody is born attracted to men or attracted to women, that's that, then a scientist coming in with a legitimate stack of brain scans and saying, you know, being sexually attracted to children and maybe even sexual attractions in general is something that's built in. People at this point are well prepared to understand that. That did not turn out to be so controversial. What we do with this information has turned out to be much more controversial. So there are still people who kind of insist that they can cure pedophilia because it's somehow a choice. You know, there exist pockets of that.
Okay, I know that when they were trying to kind of portray pedophilia as, let's say, a type of orientation, something that you're born with, I knew that there were some pockets of people that found that to be offensive.
Pedophilia is the actual sexual preference for children. These people find children hotter than they find adults. But that's different from a child molester. A child molester is a person who actually commits the hands-on or whatever sexual abuse of the kid. If we excuse the politics and just look at the actual data, if our definition of sexual orientation is a pattern of sexual interest that a person has, is born with, can't change, and they have no choice but to do the best they can with what they have, well then, yeah, pedophilia fits that definition. We might want to pick a different term because we are uncomfortable, but there's but the science behind it is as solid as science gets.
Right. So that was one of the comments that he made that most disturbed me. I mean, that is that's actually not manipulating language. That's an outright lie to say that it's as solid as science gets. Why would you be saying that to basically and he says this when he talks to major television networks and stuff like that as well.
Jen, can I, you know, it's interesting. And I didn't hear from Cantor, not that he is or is not paying attention, but, you know, either the three of us or me on my podcast, it's time. But, you know, Cantor comes across when you interact with him, nothing personal towards him, but he becomes a snob. Well, I don't have much tolerance for that. He will quickly remind me that he is published and I am not. That's fine. But, you know, he has an open invitation, a standing invitation to come on and chat with me. Okay. Again, to bring it full circle, when these people are pushing myths, they can do so if they've mastered the art of, how do I want to put it? Everything from facial expression to a degree of confidence because they're pushing the big lie. Okay, listen to what he said. We can go back through it, but it's settled science. Dr. Cantor, what is settled science? You have brain scans which take a snapshot of the brain at a specific point in time, so now it's static. You have nothing to do a chronological walk back through the person's life. So you're doing a grand leap because you took a brain scan, I'm going to make this up, a 30-year-old, and his brain's different. And so you say, it must have been in utero. Okay, that's science? No, that's myth. That's faith. What I would say is this, it's much more plausible and much more understandable that the brain has changed because of, and it matches the data, because of porn use, the white and gray matter. If we were to put them under a functional scan, I have no doubt we would find the brain operating the same as psychopaths. And the bottom line is this. James Cantor will avoid the issue of porn use for any minor attracted person. He came up with, or somebody came up with, he's pushing that, this term. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm here to tell you that term no longer works. It went out of existence because I now have changed the term because it's settled science. And I say these are men who lust after kids because of porn use. So they're not MAPS, they are MLACs.
Right. And that's something
I can say it because he's never worked in a prison. He's never worked around pedophiles. He's worked around them in an office setting and he's taking them at face value. He doesn't know if they're lying. He says, I've heard this, he can tell. Really? Well, I'm trained in the PCLR. I don't think he is, but at the same time, isn't it interesting? There's a book on how to pass, this is for psychopaths, how to pass the PCLR. And so I'm trained in assessing psychopaths for truthfulness, yet he's telling me he can discern. He's lying through his teeth as far as settled science. Give me a break. And so he's brazen, he's bold, and that's what causes people to take a step back, because he's an assistant professor. Well, I was an assistant professor at Geneva College for years. Okay, Canner, so I can be an academic too. But you have no clue. These guys have no clue what these minor attracted guys do once they leave the office. They have no way of assessing their online porn accessing, or the access to porn.
Right.
Every one of these guys are, when they get busted, they have child porn on them.
Right, and that's something I wanted to clear up about your argument from last week. Is basically you've said that there's no such thing as a non-offending pedophile, right? And some people sort of like, what do you mean? Surely there's some people who don't offend, but I think what people need to understand is that it wasn't always this way. I think the law was changed in 1983, but mere possession of child pornography is a criminal offense. And in your experience, you found that 100% of pedophiles were caught with child pornography on their computers. And so that's, at least that's how I'm understanding it. That's why you say there's no such thing as a non-offending pedophile.
Right. And I'll add to that. To be able to look at the American people in the eye, or the Canadian people, and say this kind of stuff like it's settled science, you're lying through your teeth, Canner. Come on and we'll talk about it. Honestly, I'm done with this stuff. I have no tolerance anymore for a guy that's done research in a lab, research in an office, and hasn't spent time behind bars with these guys where you can watch them 24/7. But anyways, I digress for a second. When any guy says, I'm attracted to kids, you already know he's been into porn and gone down those steps for years. And I'll tell you why he's doing it. An insurance policy. That's what's going on here with Canner and others, because they know if and when the guy gets busted, and I notice this, they do a little sleight of hand, which is this. They'll say, oh, minor attracted men have never offended. And you say, have they ever looked at porn? No, especially child porn. Okay. So they'll say the guy's never looked at child porn, but they can't prove it. Then they'll say this. We know that he's never looked at it because we can discern when he's being honest. Okay. But if and when that same guy that yesterday was saying he never looks at child porn gets busted, guess what they'll say? Well, you know what? It turns out he wasn't a map. He was a pedophile. He wasn't being honest with us. Oh, okay. So we've got the ultimate escape clause.
Okay.
Yeah.
Segue. Let me just interject there, because what you said is just right, because they do this with transgender people too. So they're always when they try to say that it's not a bad thing for men who identify as women to be in women's private spaces and stuff like that. Whenever you have an instance of a transgender male attacking or raping or whatever to a female, what you'll see the transgender community do come out every time. They'll come out and say, oh, well, he wasn't really transgendered. He's just a predator. He's not really transgender. Right.
You can take to the bank. If anybody tells you they are minor attracted, they're saying that for a reason, because if they get busted, they want to go to treatment or be given less confinement time in prison, because now they can say they have an illness or a disorder.
Right. Now, here's the other thing that we didn't get into that I wanted to touch on briefly, and this is the idea that James Cantor is promoting the use of lifelike child sex dolls for these pedophiles, and presumably anybody who wants to buy them to use in order to sort of work out their secret fantasies about children and stuff. What are your feelings on this idea that, and Barbara Kay, who writes for the National Post here in Canada, has said that she agrees that child sex dolls are a good thing to introduce to society because it will help control pedophilia.
I simply asked them how many pedophiles behind bars that they worked with. Tell me how many years and in what way have they worked with pedophiles? You work with a pedophile in an office and you haven't worked with a pedophile. They are the world's greatest liars and deceivers. So if your research, I don't care who, but if anybody's research into pedophilia is solely based upon verbal reports, and brain scan, that's a static issue. Verbal reports, you're done. Child sex dolls will do to anybody that has descended into child porn what lighter fluid would do to flames.
Right. And this is supported by the actual FBI evidence too. Let me just show you something that I have along those lines, because this was my response to James Cantor, who had a very short interaction with me before blocking me. But let's just take a look here. Okay, so this is from the FBI. Okay, so when used, and they're talking here about pornography, violent pornography, and child pornography, when used by individuals who have a predisposed sexual interest in children, child pornography can sexually arouse them, fuel their sexual fantasies about children, validate their sexual attraction to children, and help them rationalize this behavior. All of these behaviors increase the risk that these individuals will act out their fantasies by sexually molesting children. Our practical experience, this is the FBI, confirms these findings. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit has conducted interview upon interview of child sex offenders. The information obtained from the offenders themselves leaves no doubt that the child pornography fuels some child pornographers to live out their fantasies on real children. And here's another one on pornography use. A few other third variables have been implicated in the relationship between DSF and sexual offending, but they are not consistently measured. For example, research has found that pornography is intimately related to sexual fantasies in that it provides rich material and themes for fantasies to appropriate and build on. Across numerous studies, pornography use has also been implicated in sexual offending. For example, Guy and colleagues found that pornography was linked to the development, maintenance, and/or escalation of sexual offending for a large number of offenders. Now, the thing is that James Cantor, as a researcher, should be aware of all of this stuff that's been out there. When he's saying that these lifelike child sex dolls are going to somehow defuse these potential predators, he's ignoring the studies that the FBI had established long ago that catering to these fantasies is going to make the situation worse.
And he knows it. He's a bright guy. He doesn't want people to connect the dots. If having deviance saturation, that's what we're talking. Okay, if you're going to saturate somebody with deviance, then of all populations of sex offenders, the child perpetrators would be the most satiated because they're busted with how much porn all the time? Hundreds of thousands of pictures. I mean, do the math in terms of how many minutes a day there is. There isn't even enough time to go through that. And why is it that they have to collect it? Okay. And that should satisfy them, right? Using that logic. No, that primes the pump. Therefore, it no longer satisfies. It will cause them to shift gears. You give anybody a human-like person or a robot, and same thing for adult sex bots, all it will do is prime the pump. Those that defend it have never worked with predators behind bars. I'm telling you, because I've interacted with a lot of them. I've interacted with guys that create these artificial intelligence sex bots. They've never worked with predators. James Cantor has never worked with predators.
Right. And this
Yet
is what
somehow they're the experts, and we're supposed to take this leap of faith when we're talking about what happens if he's wrong.
Precisely.
Okay?
If
I'm wrong, kids are still safe. If Cantor's wrong, what he's done is he's primed the potential of a serial murderer.
Right. So that's coming from your experience with pedophiles and sexual predators in prison. That's real hands-on, long-term experience. And I said before that I've got my own experience dealing with sexual deviance, having worked in prostitution. And I know that the vast majority of them who have gotten into this deviance, they don't stop, right? They always progress to the next level of deviance. So if your level of deviance is having sex with a lifelike child sex doll, what is the next level that you're going to go up to, right? It's nothing personal in terms of psychologists, John, but I haven't had a whole lot of faith in psychologists in my life, because when I was a child, I went through 6 different homes altogether.
And I agree, Jen. By the way, I have huge concerns about people in psychology. I do.
Right. So I went through 6 different homes by the time I emancipated myself at the age of 16, and I went through all kinds of abuse and stuff. But because I went through all of these homes and abuse and stuff, I was mandated by social services to go see a psychologist on a regular basis. So I went and saw a psychologist on a regular basis, and what I came to understand, none of it really sort of registered, the significance of it registered with me when I was a kid. But as far as I was concerned, when I was a kid, there was just another adult that I couldn't trust, right? And when I look back at all of the assessments and stuff that psychologists did of me, on me, they got almost everything about me wrong. They did not understand me at all. So that sort of helped shape my view of psychologists going into the future. But that sort of correlates with the whole pedophile thing, in the sense that these doctors sort of prodded me, and they were getting me to answer questions and stuff, but I wasn't answering honestly. I was answering in the way that I thought would be safe for me to answer, and not covering things that I felt uncomfortable about answering, right? And so they ended up with a completely skewed impression of what I was and what my problems were.
Absolutely. And I don't blame you. And having worked with kids in the system, I've seen it, or I saw it time and time again. And then working with men in the system, kids in the system are in there for a lot of different reasons. There's the vast majority have been through trauma in one way or the other, almost all of them. But no, I've seen it time and time again. And that's a perfect segue then into talking about kids in the trans end of things, because a kid is in a very vulnerable position. Kids aren't stupid. You just nailed it, Jen, right? A kid's only going to tell you what is in his best interest, and meaning what's going to get him off the hot seat, or what's going to get him out of the stupid therapist's office. Most of these kids have, like you, Jen, you saw how many therapists when you were growing up? How many counselors did you see?
It wasn't a whole lot, because I lived in not a heavily populated area. I think I saw about 3 different ones during the course of my childhood.
But that's enough, right? After the first one, you kind of
they all got it wrong. Yeah, they all got it wrong.
Yeah,
they didn't start with what you'd think would be a basic one with me. So the basic one thing for a child in my situation that is so crystal clear for me in years past, I didn't understand why I was doing what I was doing. A lot of it had to do with my sense of self-worth, which had been destroyed, right? And especially when you're dealing with foster kids, unless you start there, you're not going to understand these kids, right? But none of them started there, right?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, and again, as we start to talk about the concerns about the trans movement, I worked with kids in the system for years, and first of all, there was nothing as far as gender identity and gender dysphoria prior to the year 2005, or you don't have that. Mm-hmm. And if ever you're going to see unique behaviors, it's working with kids in the system. Right. Well, when you look at the charts, you see this is not a trend. This is a tidal wave. But if anybody understands kids that have been wounded, or kids that have been damaged, or kids, and I use that term loosely, meaning damaged emotions, they're only going to tell you whatever they're going to tell you if they trust you, number one. But they will respond appropriately, meaning honestly, if you simply normalize what they've been through. Mm-hmm. That's how you start that conversation. And it's in that context that stuff will come up, because no kid wants to live with confusion on the inside. And for a kid to wrestle with what we're going to be talking about, that confusion in terms of gender came from outside of him. Because if a kid becomes sexualized or has sexual thoughts prior to puberty, guess what? It came from the outside. And I haven't met a kid yet who's not willing to talk about that if it happened. But I also haven't met a kid that shows signs of sexual issues that hasn't been impacted, usually by having been groomed or sexually abused.
Right. Okay. So, yeah, getting into to trans kids and stuff, because I started expressing cross-gender when I was about 9 or 10. What we should do is you said that you have 4 different categories of trans kids that you've identified?
Yeah.
Yeah. What are those? Maybe you can just go over.
And it comes from, I would say, if anybody's worked with kids in a halfway decent fashion, you're going to conclude the same thing, because we're talking about kids that are now so focused on their own sexuality prior to puberty. And then after that, they're still so focused on it that this becomes their entire identity. Okay, you're talking a pretty profoundly impacted kid. Working with kids in the system, I can't recall one, quite frankly, that was hung up, even those that have been severely abused. Okay, some of the ones that were fire setting, I mean, it's that level that you would have a constant drumbeat of sexuality. But most kids want to get on with their life and learn new things and learn new skills. So if you have a young person who their sole focus during the day, it's different than peer pressure, it's different than making friends, but if their sole focus is their own sex and sexuality, something's entered into the picture to cause them to become that myopic and that focused on it. Okay, so what you're dealing with is primarily sexually abused kids. So if some kid is so focused on their sex and sexuality that now they're starting to identify as the opposite sex, you've got a couple of reasons for that. And any therapist, and this is my concern number one about gender therapists, is the red flags are screaming out in this order. And if you can't pick these up as a therapist, you better get out of the field. Because if you overlook a kid who has been sexually abused and is being sexually abused, possibly, if not likely, or being groomed, and you don't intervene to help that kid, then you're complicit. Okay, so the very first thing, if you have a kid that is highly sexualized and or fixated on their own sexuality, the younger they are, the more this applies. The first thing you should think of is this child has been sexually abused,
or otherwise,
and they are rejecting their own gender because their own gender is bringing pain. So a little boy, a little girl is being molested, and guess what? They don't want it. They figure, because it's very childlike logic, if it's a girl, if I can just be a boy, they wouldn't keep hurting me like this. So that's the very first thing and it used to be taught for any therapist. That's the number one red flag of sexual abuse. A young child talking about they don't want to be their gender. Okay. The second, and this is fairly recent in terms of like dating back to about 2000, is when we started to see the wave of autistic kids. Now it's been changed to autism spectrum.
I'll bring up the graphs and numbers on that shortly.
There you go. I think there's reasons why. I have my own bias because my own kid was affected right after immunizations in a very radical way. So I think it stems back from the immunizations, but people debate that. But either way, somebody has to explain this increase. My wife is a school teacher, and she says that they were seeing a tidal wave of kids on the autism spectrum coming in. They're having to hire special ed teachers for this.
Right. Okay. So I'll bring up all of the studies on that in just a moment. Now, I know the other two categories that you put in there were kids who are being influenced by pop culture and kids who are being groomed. Now, just to set that up, though, what I want to do is I want to show some videos that will give people an idea of what we're talking about. I don't think there's anything else that we needed to cover from last time. But just before I play the first video, just sort of looking at my own experience, and this is sort of a category that I add because I think there's an organic thing that can happen too. So again, I talk about that when I was a kid, psychologists didn't really understand me or address it properly. When I was a kid, I was bullied viciously in school. So by my peers, because I had emotional problems, I was bullied viciously. And frequently the people who are opposed to me, and when I'm speaking out on some of these gender programs in schools and stuff, they'll say to me that, oh, you don't care about kids being bullied, right? It's one of the most offensive things they can say to me. I spent my entire time in school being viciously bullied, right? So, but the thing is that when I look back at my childhood, and I think about all of the bullying and stuff that I was exposed to, I could say that the biggest bully I ever faced in my childhood was me, right? I was so hard on myself, right? Because of outside stimuli and stuff, sort of, and being sort of moved from home to home, I developed this powerful negative conception of myself, right? And so talking about when I started expressing as transgender, 9 or 10, what happened is I was in a home where I had a super pretty, super popular foster sister, right? And she had all kinds of male friends and all kinds of female friends. She was surrounded by this entourage everywhere she went. She was so popular. She seemed to live in this bubble of, perpetual positive energy. And when I looked at her life and compared her life to my life, it was like, oh, wow, why couldn't that be my life? And that's when I started first experimenting with cross-gender expression. I tried sort of dressing up like she did and wearing the same clothes and imagining that I was sort of the super popular foster sister and stuff, right? So that was sort of like an organic thing that happened. Although that kind of grew out of what I would call the hyper-sexualization of females in our society. And I believe this plays a big role in transgender identity in general. So one of my big theories is that the transgender phenomenon, like if you go back across the breadth of time, what you'll find is as society has become increasingly sexualized and increasingly focused on the hypersexual aspects of women specifically, and as pornography has become more and more and more common, as that goes up on the graphs there, you can see transgender identity going up on the graph with it. And that's, in my opinion, because society is being, in some ways, traumatized. Like our focus as a society and the culture on the hypersexual and pornography and stuff is totally out of balance with what any other creature in nature, right? So we're obsessed with hypersexuality. And I think what has happened is that the collective subconscious, indeed, I would say especially the conscious of men, has been traumatized, right? And a lot of the men who are expressing as transgender are doing so because they've become so attracted to this image that they want to be that, right? And that's what I was when I was a kid, right? So I had this hypersexual teen foster sister, and I wanted to be that. So I think that sexualization of our society is playing a big sort of subconscious role in the shaping of transgender identity. But also they're sort of feeding that too. So the difference is that when I was a kid, okay, when I started first expressing as transgender, like I got really bold. I would get dressed up with all the makeup and mini skirts and stuff. I go walking around town, right? But I only did it when no one was around because I kind of understood that it was taboo or forbidden at that day in time. But I got caught by my foster father coming back from one of these walks once, and he was sort of a Christian, old school World War II veteran, right? And when I came in the door, right, dressed up like this, he was like, oh, whoa, what is this, right? And immediately he told me that, listen, you shouldn't be doing this. Okay, this is very dangerous behavior. And so I received immediate sort of, which you might call balancing feedback, right? Telling me that this is something that I shouldn't be doing. And he recognized that this was essentially deviant behavior. Now, probably he understood that had to do with sort of my psychology generally, so he wasn't too hard on me, and he tried to keep it between him and I. But the thing is that if that had happened today, right? If that had happened today, they would have pointed at me and said, okay, well, here's a girl who's trapped in a boy's body crying out for his true identity. But what I say in my public talks, and I tell this little story, is that I wasn't a girl trapped in a boy's body crying out for my true identity. I was a child crying out for help.
There you go.
Right. So what I want to do is I want to get people sort of up to speed on what's going on when we talk about pop culture and sexual grooming that is going around the transgender issue here. I've got some clips to show you here. The first one that we're going to look at here.
Now, Jen, if I might, somebody might, having listened to your story, and it doesn't contradict what I was saying, in this sense that everything you explained makes perfect sense. Mm-hmm. Yet you haven't grown into someone who's advocating for the sexualizing of kids. You're actually very protective of kids. Mm-hmm. When you look at, and it's a perfect segue into what you're going to bring up, you look at amazing Desmond and all these young kids.
Desmond is amazing.
You cannot tell me that these kids are coming up with this by themselves, acting this way by themselves, and that they're not in danger. And in fact, they haven't already been perped on.
Right. And that'll be
a huge difference. And that is my concern on my end. You know, you're speaking to the medicalization. That's a huge concern for me, but you're the expert in that. Because of what I know, a predator will do anything he needs to do to gain access to vulnerable kids, to gain access to kids, number one. The more vulnerable they are, the more it's cat and mouse they get to toy with this. Mm-hmm. And they know that entering into the realm of this trans stuff are kids that have already been groomed in one way or another, and now it's easy pickings. And so now they're becoming everything from mentors to, there's a million different ways. Drag queen story hour. You look at any of these guys that are sexualized, that are acting in sexual fashion, and then bringing up sexual topics to these kids. That is not, there's only one reason they're doing that.
Right.
That's our concern. That's
right. And what I would say is that, okay, so again, back to myself, had I been reinforced in my confusions as a kid, I would say, I might not be whole today. I might not even be alive today. But my Christian World War II, old school foster father sort of discouraged that in me generally, and society as well. But just before I go on to the drag queen story time and stuff video, I want to play something briefly from Judith Reisman. And I don't want any of my LGBT viewers to get upset out there about what she's saying, because I want to make a point. I don't agree with every single thing she says, but she makes a very valid point. When I heard it, the first time I heard it, I thought, what is she talking about? And other people might think that it doesn't make sense, but it actually does make sense. So let's just listen to Judith Reisman.
All pornography is homosexual. All pornography is homosexual. Let's try that one more time. All pornography is homosexual. It goes. You go on my website and you'll find a paper on that. All pornography is homoerotic. How does the Judeo-Christian belief system feel about adultery? Hey, you don't do that, okay? How do pornography feel about adultery? Oh, that's cool. That, everything's okay. Promiscuity, anal sodomy, every kind of sexual activity. Well, so that becomes an agreement on every level of homosexual activity. I should have mentioned that. that is what happens to the guys. Guys who use pornography are engaged in homosexual activity. The only difference on that, the criteria of 50 variables, the only difference being the choice of a particular, particular object, to use at that particular moment. But that object changes tomorrow, the next day, in the next hour, it can change. And more, it isn't eye-to-eye, lip-to-lip activity you're ever going to see. It is rear activity. It is bottom. And the bottom is the homosexual.
Okay, so one thing, so right there, she talks about infidelity, right? I do know many LGBT people who are monogamous, right? So I'll just put that out there, but she's right in the sense that certainly promiscuity in the LGBTQ community has been documented to be much above the heterosexual community. But what I found interesting in that statement there is he was saying all pornography is homosexual pornography. And you think, okay, well, what about guy on girl? That's not homosexual. But what I have found, and this gets back to this hyper-sexualization of society that I talked about. So back when I was doing sex work, what I found was that I think that what's happened is with men being saturated in pornography, they see the male phallus so much that eventually in time they become attracted to it. Right. And so when men would even outside of sex work would hit on me and stuff, they would still describe themselves as heterosexual. Right. The majority of them would say they're heterosexual, even though they want to get together with me. And I think what's happened there is that pornography has had this effect where normally straight guys are now attracted to the male phallus, but because they're not naturally homosexual, they need some sort of bridge that allows them to go explore this new fetish that they have, and that's where transgender came in. So when she says that all pornography is homosexual pornography, it kind of is in the sense that the men are sort of focusing on male body parts and male functioning, and this has a real result, from my experience, in men going out there and seeking that.
I actually feel very good towards or about Judith Reisman. Now, I haven't heard that clip. I've never seen that clip. I don't know what the full context is. My introduction to Judith Reisman was her unmasking of Alfred Kinsey. It's groundbreaking and it was eye-opening for me. What I would say is I don't know exactly what she's getting at, because I would say this, that the vast majority of men that I've worked with, the vast majority of the porn started as heterosexual, then transitions into more deviant stuff. I mean, once you open up the door to deviance, the sky's the limit. Now, could I see a guy strictly dealing with heterosexual porn? Yeah, I have to admit, I'm not up on all the porn. So, this would, if I'd stayed in the prison system, I probably would have gotten more information about this. Could I see a situation where a guy stays with heterosexual porn, eventually getting into really dark stuff, harming women, eventually prior to child porn? This is something I did not know until hearing it from the pedophiles. And then I found it virtually without exception is they'll get into bestiality first and then child porn. Well, you can't get worse. And so do I have a hard time believing that I don't know everything out there as far as the different roots of all, as far as you trace these things down? It's almost like roots of a tree. So you start to look at the different channels or streets, offshoots that the guy's taken. Could I see that? Could I conceptualize a guy never having gotten into homosexuality and eventually into kids? I can conceive of that. What percentage of the pedophiles were strictly just male pedophiles with girl victims? I think 0. Now that I'm thinking about it, 0.0. I'm just trying to think. In 11 years, did I ever see a guy that was busted with only female girl pictures and girl victims? And I can't think of one. So what it means is, and a lot of the pedophiles were married you can't tell me that suddenly a guy has maintained porn with the or opposite sex porn, and all of a sudden finds a child attractive in boys.
Mm-hmm.
So he has to have ventured into that on the way down. The vast majority of pedophiles were all boys. I'm sorry, the victims were all boys. 50 to 60%. And then it was in the minority where a pedophile has boy and girl victims. And I didn't know that until working with the pedophiles and seeing the police reports, seeing the victims. So the majority of pedophiles are homosexual, because the moment, if you're a guy and you touch a guy sexually, you are into homosexuality. It's same gender, same sex. Now, to what extent do you solely do that? Okay, I can make the case. There's the difference between a fool and foolishness. Mm-hmm. But when you're talking deviance, I just view it in terms of dark, morally dark. Mm-hmm. So I don't get hung up so much over homosexual versus heterosexual. I just think once a guy starts to go dark, I'm not so much looking for gender-related issues. I'm looking for how dark, how debased is a guy getting?
Right. Well, again, it's a saturation, this unnatural saturation in hypersexuality that society has digressed into. But now they're beginning to, pop culture is beginning to groom kids, and they're starting to groom kids in school. So let me just go on to this first video clip that looks at some of the shows that you're going to be talking about when we look at your graph here. So let's just look at the first one.
RuPaul's Drag Race is back, and it's bigger than ever. Just meet my new queens. Annie.
Are you ready for a show? Yeah! It's season 11, bitch.
You better let a bitch know. Giving them life so right from head to toe. Bringing that heat when it's 26 below. London, Paris, New York, disco. Blown up TV and radio. Next level vibe so fly you can't ignore. So sky high, she's a super dope. This season, go wig. Or go home. Since long ago, she got the glow. She overflow. It's stereo. Wherever you go, look out below. She about to blow.
I'm about to lash out.
Intergalactic, Earth to Pluto. Superstar boss all through the cosmos.
Bigger. It's always better.
Get dragged into the phenomenon. RuPaul's Drag Race season 11, coming soon.
Another glamorous night in New York City. Let's talk to some rising superstars from the new VH1 program, Transform Me. And the ladies today are particularly lovely.
They're very creamy, soft, dewy, and fresh. The biggest message of the show is that most of us, no matter who we are, have felt like there's a person inside of us that is not reflected on the outside.
Look at your hair. You got some pretty hair. Can I touch it? So as a transsexual, you've gone through your own transformation.
Definitely.
What advice would you give to transsexuals out there in Middle America who maybe want to follow in your footsteps?
Strive to be yourself, and if you feel that you can't because of your community or your family, get away from that. Transform Me is a makeover show where me, Nina Poon, and Jamie Clayton travel all over the country, transforming women, using what we've learned transforming ourselves.
Where did the idea come from to do the show?
The idea actually came from my production company, Complete World Domination, and we went in and pitched the idea, and they loved it. It's all about loving yourself. There are a lot of really intense, emotional moments that are quite wonderful that allow the women to open up to this new transformation. I mean, I know in my own transformation, as a transgender woman, that I've had a lot of struggles and a lot of psychological and emotional stuff that I've had to get over and work through, and that's really what it's about on the show as well.
This is Mike Diamond with the lovely, lovely ladies of Transform Me, a wonderful new program coming to VH1. Say hi, ladies.
Hi.
When the world probably thought the Kardashian-Jenner family couldn't make headlines any more than they already were, Caitlyn Jenner's still Bruce Jenner at the time proved this theory wrong. I think that Bruce announcing his decision to become Caitlyn was one of the biggest shockers in Hollywood to date, and certainly not something people were expecting. We first knew Bruce Jenner as an Olympic gold medalist athlete who set records in the men's decathlon.
Jenner's really piling up the points. He sprints through the hurdles for 8:66. He hurls the javelin for 8:62. He's done it! Bruce Jenner set a new world decathlon record.
In this fourth event, the high jump, Bruce Jenner attempting 1.97 meters, 6 feet 5 1/2 inches. Dixon is already out. There he is, up and over, and that's a good jump. And 197 is worth 831 points.
In April 2015, Bruce came out as a trans woman during an interview on 2020. Caitlyn is 69 years old at the time of this recording, so she clearly lived many years and a few marriages as Bruce before claiming her current identity.
I'm telling my story. People don't understand looking into the mirror and nothing seems right. Putting on clothes that you just really don't identify with. This is about getting to be who you really are.
You've got to try to find happiness.
We're going to talk about everything. We're going to do a lot of fun things for the first time. We're going to go shopping for the first time. Maybe even some boy stuff like ride a motorcycle, because girls do that too. It's going to be quite a journey. We're going to do some good.
I consider us an ordinary family with some extraordinary circumstances.
Jazz asked me, what am I? And she would say, Mommy, am I a boy or am I a girl?
This is my sister. She's a girl. She's a girl. She's a girl.
I am transgender.
We love her just the way she is.
I am a girl. I am an artist. I am Jazz.
All new I Am Jazz. Wednesday nights at 9:30, exclusive to TLC.
Okay, so these are some of the shows that have been entered into pop culture that are having a profound effect. RuPaul, as we're going to see shortly, has had a really strong effect on creating this transgender tidal wave that you talked about. And let me just actually bring up some of your charts here that or graphs that you sent to me, and you can maybe talk about the significance of these. So let's look at the first one here. Okay,
yeah,
so
what people are going to see, first of all, and again, wearing the hat of a therapist, but also just any of us can see this. When you think of human behavior, think of how people change and the process of change, all that. Usually it's pretty slow, but then again, you know, people have been pretty much the same for thousands and thousands of years. We tried to figure out people, but when you have an anomaly outside the bell-shaped curve, something pretty extreme, the topic of changing genders is pretty extreme. It's different than changing clothes. So, you know, trends, fads come and go, but when you're talking about the end result or the implications of what we're talking about, is sex change. That's the logical extension and conclusion of this. You're talking a sex change for a kid. Okay, it's never been heard of before, and so the one thing to see with these graphs is this a trend? Is this something in the water? Is this fluoride? This is not a trend. This is a tidal wave. Therefore, just at face value, you don't have to know anything other than this, that nothing grows like this. These are referrals. These are graphs. Typically, the majority of these have to do with referrals either in the UK or Ireland. But going back to the very first one, Jen, if I might, where it showed the red, there you go. I'm sorry, right there. Okay, that is the DSM-4. That was published back in, 94. The DSM-4R was 2000. So we'll go back even further. When I said it didn't exist at once upon a time, the issue of transgender never existed. Mm-hmm. In the field of mental health, look at the amount of referrals back in 94. And if you go back further, ready? It just doesn't exist. So you suddenly have this thing, and it's not like changing your hair color. These are kids that want to change their sex. Suddenly appears, and you can see that there are two things that influence these things. One just happens to be timing. The DSM-4, the red book that you saw initially, that was the very first introduction to, actually, Jen, can we go back with that? Right there. Okay, the DSM-4 introduced for the very first time in clinical language gender identity. That term never existed prior to the DSM-4. Okay, so it sets the stage. There'll be another overlapping chart that we'll see. So that introduced, and therefore it became billable, meaning as a clinician, you could get paid for diagnosing and working with a kid and then a teen that had gender identity issues. So what do we see? We start to see referrals start to little by little. There you go. Now, introduce the DSM-5. This was back in 2013. Do we happen to notice anything? That was the very first time gender dysphoria came to the forefront. Nobody ever heard of that in the clinical world. Never once in my grad school program that was headed up by very intelligent people that worked with some groundbreaking individuals. Gerald Corey was the world premier person in groups. Dr. Sonstagard worked with Adler, who was a counterpart of Freud, for Adlerian psychology, which all school counseling comes out of Adlerian. Okay, so there were some very heavy hitters. How many times did we ever talk about the issue of gender identity or gender dysphoria? Zero. It didn't exist. Working with kids in the system. How many gender confused kids did I ever work with? That's different than gender impacted as far as abuse. There was not one. And I worked with a lot of kids. So it wasn't until this became billable as far as gender dysphoria. Just so happens, look at what happens.
Right, billable.
Clinicians can start to bill for this, and voila,
and
what do we have?
Yeah, and they did a little trickery in DSM-5. So in DSM-5, they've still got it in there for billing purposes, but they've actually, I don't think there's any other condition listed in the DSM-5 that actually does what they do with gender dysphoria. They say that, yes, it's a billable condition and stuff, but it's not a mental disorder, right? So what's it doing in the book? So that's a political.
It's based upon perception. Okay, now there we go. Now that's a wonderful graph because now look, you can see now again, I'm in the field. I know the implications, what the detractors could say, that I'm anti-DSM. No, I'm not. But we're talking about kids that are going through life-altering changes as far as putting chemicals in their bodies and going through sex changes that will leave them permanently sterilized, having double mastectomies, oophorectomies, hysterectomies, and castration. This is not a mild issue. This is life-changing. So we better get this right. And if this had been a real issue, then we should have seen it forever. But we don't. That is not a trend. That's a tidal wave.
Right.
It didn't exist. It comes out of the blue, and there are a number of influences.
So DSM-5 and pop culture, and you can see here RuPaul.
That's right. Okay, so people are making big bucks off of this. That's a huge concern for me as well. So the three primary issues, I can list off a couple of special interests. One is doctors making big bucks off this. Pharmaceuticals, because once a kid starts this, let me ask you, so a boy starts to transition to a girl or vice versa, what would happen to Bruce Jenner right there, Caitlyn, if Caitlyn stopped paying a doctor for hormones? Caitlyn would become Bruce again.
Right.
This is unnatural and artificial, because if it were real, guess what? You wouldn't have to maintain it chemically, but you have to maintain it. So somebody's making big bucks, a doctor, pharmaceuticals, and my greatest concern is the predator end of things, because these are kids that are confused. Now look at the influences. So you had Bruce Jenner. This is, how do you deny this? Here comes Jazz Jennings. And if you fast forward to poor Jazz's life a couple of months ago, she has an absolute meltdown, and it started a year ago. Okay, and here's some other influences. So if you pan the camera, not you, Jen, but if we think in terms of what's gone into this, well, is it too far-fetched to believe that behind the scenes, because the new versions of any DSM are in the works for about 10 years. You have a working group. Well, okay, I'm not the greatest conspiratorial kind of person, but it's not hard for me to see, especially who makes up the working group, that maybe, just maybe, some people have been talking, some people have been coordinating things. And you look at, I mean, I've been kicked off Twitter. Jen, you've been kicked off Twitter. Why have I been kicked off? Because, I affirmed a trans guy who said she was a girl, who said she was a guy. I can't even figure it out. They just said, oh, they have more kahunas than I did. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I said, I affirm your manliness. Literally. I'm kicked off of Twitter because I affirmed some trans person's manliness.
Right.
Okay, but again, what are the implications? There are predators, and so here's my big thing. Predators will access kids wherever they are, whether church, that's why churchprotect.org, that was the very first thing I started. That's my biggest concern. Okay. Boy Scouts, Boys and Girls Club, whatever it is. Predators will dress anyway, drag queen story hour, furries, do a little research, just Google furries. Whenever you have an adult that plays dress up and hides 100% of his identity, if it's all adults, I don't care what adults do. But if there are kids around, why is a guy hiding his identity and trying to access kids? If you think of regular situations, regular marriage and family counseling, one of the most often things you will hear from a wife when you're doing couples counseling is this: I'm frustrated with my husband because he's not involved in the lives of our kids. Okay, that's a typical guy that you need to educate that, hey, you know what? Maybe you should be a little more involved, not a workaholic or not spend much time on the basketball court for yourself. We need to help you get involved in the life of your kids. That's a normal guy. It's not right. And you want to educate and bring him along and help him clue in to get involved in the life of his kids. What I'm talking about is we got a bunch of adult men that really are interested and energetically invested in being around kids. That's not normal, number one. Number two, they want to play dress up. And you're telling me guys that want to dress up in women's underwear and drag and purposely do so they can access kids at the library? And you want to tell me what I heard for 11 years in sex offender treatment doesn't apply to these guys? Okay. I'll tell you what the previous I'll tell you what my sex offender guys would say. They would say, are you kidding me? Of course he's perping on kids. Of course they're grooming.
Okay, well, this gets into my next clip, which is looking at the evolution of something known as drag queen story time, which suddenly appeared not just in Canada, not just in the United States, but all around the globe. So let's take a look at this short clip.